And we're up.
Yes, we are. I'm just giving it a second. There we go. Okay.
All right. So do you want to lead it or do you want me to do it?
Can you get us started? They're like running laps right now.
Sure. For everyone who's tuned in so far, welcome to the second board game club. I'm Ryan, and that's Aaron.
Hi.
And so for November, we're going to be talking all about Suburbia, which is a 2012 game, which was one of the inaugural games by Bezier. And it's a city building tile game where each person is essentially in charge of their own borough, their own district of the city that we're trying to kind of city plan and build up. And your goal is to have the biggest population in your particular part of the city by the end of the game. That's kind of the general premise in a nutshell. And so this is kind of a really interesting game because it's kind of it really is your classic city builder. And we thought that it'd be kind of a nice transition from viticulture, which was kind of your kind of quintessential worker placement game. And so that's kind of why we chose it for November. It's been out for about 4 years or so. So most people have at least heard about it, if not played it, and it's been very well received since. I know Aaron's a big fan of it.
I am. I love Suburbia. It has all of the tile laying awesomeness that I generally want, but without like really any confrontation.
Right. I mean, that's kind of part of why this game is so well liked.
Excuse me.
No, not allowed.
What's next?
So for those who haven't actually played Suburbia, I thought it would be really helpful to start off by just kind of giving a rough run through on how the game works. So Suburbia is not quite an auction game, but it's a limited market. So what's going to happen is each person in the game starts off with a cat, apparently, who's about to knock things over. So 1 second. Okay, better. So we're just like full of animals that are just making our lives better in so many ways.
It's my fault. I'm sorry.
So in Suburbia, everybody starts out with 3 generic city tiles, which are actually these 3 here. And each of them correspond to kind of the generic portions of your part of the city. So you have the residential section, they call it the suburbs. You have kind of your industrial area, so you have your heavy factory, and then you have your kind of your municipal area, which in this case is a community park. Every person starts off with one of these, and throughout the course of each round, each person is going to add a tile generally to their city to help it grow and expand. And so the game kind of sprawls in your tableau as you go. And what you're doing is on your turn is you're going to buy a new tile, generally speaking, and each tile has a number of different things on them. They have a cost, so they have a money cost, but they also have 2 different trackers, essentially, that you're going to keep track of throughout the course of the game. The numbers in the circles, and it's a little hard to see, but I'll try to hold it up here. The ones in the circles are tracking your income. That's basically how much money you get at the end of each round. And then the square number is your reputation. So that's how many people you're bringing into your portion of the city at the end of each round. And the trick to the game is that as you buy these tiles, which are going to be laid out sequentially in a row that you're going to buy each turn, you're going to have to pay a minimum of whatever the listed cost of the tile is. The cheapest ones, the ones in the far most right, you only have to pay the cost of the tile. But if you want to kind of jump the gun, you see what tiles are coming down the line, because in each game of Suburbia, you see 7 tiles at any given time. So the first 2 are you're paying cost, but everything beyond that is incrementally more expensive. You're basically playing a surplus for getting a specific tile that you want ahead of time. So it's going to get kind of costly for trying to get the brand new tile that gets flipped over. But there are points in the game where that may be worth your while, especially in really competitive sessions. But anyway, the point is that you're going to, as you're adding these tiles, it's going to adjust these income and reputation numbers. At the end of your at the end of your turn, you're going to collect money equal to your income, and you're going to add population, which is basically your VP for the game, to the VP track, to the population track, equal to your reputation. Now, these numbers can also go negative, so you can actually have your city borough kind of not be the most alluring part of the city, and so you can actually have that part of the city cost you money, or even have people leaving the city, which is what you don't want to do. But it can happen, at least in the short term. And everyone's going to keep taking turns about this. And there's the game, as the game progresses, eventually you reach a point where the tile stacks run out, and the game sort of triggers an end game where there's some end game goals that you are working, you may or may not be working towards, which gives some bonus points. And that's kind of the gist of it. You want to have the biggest population at the end of it. And the whole game is kind of managing that balance between income and reputation, where you want to have a lot of money to buy new tiles, but you want to make sure that you have the population, which is worth points at the end of the game. But you don't want to grow too fast, because for those who have played Suburbia, they know that there's basically different milestones that they call red lines. You don't want your city growing too fast, because you're essentially penalized for it, because you after you go through these certain threshold wickets on the VP track, your two tracks, your income and your reputation, kind of tick down by one. So, and that speeds up the higher you go. So if you grow too fast, you can actually hamper yourself in the long run. So it's kind of making you space out in more of kind of this marathon style versus a sprint to whoever can have the most points. So that's kind of generally how the game works in a nutshell. But we're kind of, one of the things I like about Suburbia, and Aaron, you can kind of clue in on this as well, is that it doesn't actually take very long to explain the rules of the game. It seems like a lot of what goes into the rules is the nuance to the game, more so than the actual rule set itself. It seems pretty straightforward, I would say.
It's a game with a lot of different combinations and possibilities, and so the rules are pretty simple when you're actually learning it. And then as you're playing it, that does get slowed down a fair amount, because every tile you draw, you're seeing, okay, well, what is the interaction between this tile and everything else I already have, and everything else all of my opponents already have? Because that's one of the interesting things about Suburbia, is that the tiles you play into your own tableau can impact what happens in somebody else's city too, or what happens in yours is impacted by what's going on in someone else's. So there does get to be a little bit of a slowdown and a little bit of a complicating factor there with just figuring out everything that your tile does.
Right. And so I think that's kind of part of what makes the game kind of interesting in that sense. So I guess one of the things that I would want to go kind of transition from the general rules and into kind of the first talking point would be, to wonder if people has ever run into issues or confusion with kind of the order of operations to tile placement. So in the game, generally you're just placing a tile and you're doing a number of different things, but you're going to automatically increase or decrease specific those your two main tracks, and then the tile is going to do a number of different things. It might give you money depending on the number of for example, like there are some green cards that give you money for each green tile that you have out, or stuff to that extent. So it's a little bit of I guess there's a little bit of management in kind of keep track, because some of them are going to care about immediately when you place them. Some care maybe when you place things later because of adjacency or just by having it in your city. Some actually care about what other people have on their board as well, which can be a little, I would imagine, a little hard to track, especially for newer players. So I guess for my thought is, like, have people ever had issues with kind of the order of operations of putting those tiles down? Because like the board, Suburbia actually gives you a little bit of a nice reminder here of like basically the 7 steps of things to check whenever you place a tile. But I got to admit that I rarely ever look at this. But I'm wondering, for people who maybe are newer to the game or have only played it once or twice, if that's something that they've had to reference before.
I mean, I'm not sure. It's not something that I've ever referenced. I didn't I forgot that we had those, even though you handed it to me. I didn't look at it again. And it never came up. Like, it was always just, oh, now you do the things that it tells you to do.
Right, right. And that was kind of my thought as well, is it's just not something that tends to, I think once you've played the game like once, you don't really you don't really use it. At least I think. I mean, you said yourself, like we played it earlier this evening and you hadn't played the game in what, like 2 years? And did you ever, you said you didn't even look at it.
No, I didn't. I forgot that it was there.
So does that seem like it's complicating the rules, or is it just kind of handy to have there, do you think?
I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a bad thing to have, but I also don't think, like, if you didn't have that, it wouldn't break the game. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's just a general question.
To be honest,
I
have never thought about it.
Okay, I mean that's fair, right? Like, I've never really dealt with it either, so I think there's been like once or twice in the entire time I played Suburbia where I've actually referenced those tiles. But I think other than that, I think that the rules are pretty straightforward, all things considered. The actual rule book itself is not very long. It's actually, I actually have it right here. You know, this is just kind of a component list, but the actual rules are basically this and half of this. So the entire game is really only like 2 to 3 pages of a normal rule book, and in this case, it's 1.5 in this case. So, and then on top of that, it actually has a separate rules component that actually goes into the detail of nearly every single tile in the game. So
I love when games do that.
Yeah, it's just so nice. I always love, like, particularly Dominion. I always think of Dominion in that case because they, like, in Dominion, not only do you have like explanations of nearly every single card that that expansion comes with, but then they'll be like, oh, and by the way, when it interacts with this card from this expansion, or maybe this card from this earlier expansion, it creates this really weird scenario, and we're going to tell you about it right here. I just find that really fascinating that they've taken the time to really go through that. And so I don't think Suburbia has a lot of tiles that are kind of confusing. I mean, can you think of any that off the top of your head that are kind of confusing as to how they work?
No, because they all have that little banner at the bottom that says exactly what they do. So sometimes it can be a little confusing to figure out, oh, well, does this happen every time or is it just right now? Like, we did run into that issue, but that's it.
Yeah, I just
God, we should have picked a harder game.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that is kind of like what makes, I think that's what makes Suburbia particularly resonant as a city building game, even for one that's been out for, 4 going on 5 years now, is because it's kind of accessible in that sense. It's not the complexity is in the strategy of the game, not the rules of the game. And I think for a lot of people that makes it kind of like really accessible to play and gives people incentive to come back and try something different. But I appreciate the fact that there's not a lot of tiles that can trip people up. There's definitely a couple that they're like one-off things that you're like, I'm not sure exactly what that means. And in those particular cases, then you can consult the book if you need it. So yeah, it just tends to work. I can't think of any of the top of my head that I think there's like one that is a little confusing, and I think it's one of the later blue tiles. Like, I know a couple times people have gotten confused about like PR firm, which is the one that says it's expensive. It's an expensive tile, but basically says that you get a +1 reputation when you hit those red lines, which basically says you net a 0 loss on your reputation track when you hit the red lines, which is really nice. It just means that your people don't bail on you as it gets particularly bigger, thanks to the PR firm. But if that's the first time you've seen that particular symbol, you won't know exactly what that means, and there's nothing on the card that references really. I mean, it just says +1 square for, and then it shows like a red line. So that's like the only one that comes to mind where it can be a little confusing. But for me, the only times that I get confused about tiles are those ones where they specifically are like, like the airports, for example, they care not just for your airports, they care for all airports on the board. So the ones that you have to track everything else the player is doing, I find those can be a little easy to get to overlook.
Yes. But again, that's just overlooking things. And I feel like that can happen in pretty much every game.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair. But it's just an area where I think that it can get a little where people can get tripped up. I'm just trying to think of areas where the game can get tripped up in terms of the format and the structure and the gameplay of the game, more so than what you're supposed to do, right?
Yeah.
So I think one of the really nice things about this game is the fact that it's definitely got a wide spectrum of appeal because of the fact that it has a low barrier to entry, especially for city games. Because a lot of city building games, they can get really tied up on. They can either be really, really, really simple, so like between two cities, or they can be these, basically non-confrontational 4X games where there's just a lot of stuff going on and you have to kind of micromanage everything. I find that this is kind of on the not the lighter end, but it's on the lighter end, I guess, of the spectrum.
Yes, totally.
While still having definite depth of gameplay, which I always like. So that's kind of where I would leave it on the rules, I think.
Yeah. Why don't we go ahead and talk about the game balance? Because I know this is something that's been brought up a lot on like the BGG forums and on other sites discussing Suburbia. Is some people feel like the first player has a huge advantage in this game. I'm not sure that I agree.
Yeah. So this was something that I didn't even hear about myself really until not that long ago. I mean, it was refreshed in my memory today, but I hadn't actually, dealt with that sort of thing in most of the gameplay that I've had. So that the argument goes that there's a distinct a distinct disadvantage to going first in the game, being that if you are going first, you can't actually if you're going first, you have to make your decisions before anybody else can. And then as the game gets closer to wrapping up, what's going to happen is people generally start competing for those public goals that you have. And so if you're going later in the turn order, you can see if other people are working towards those goals or not. And so that gives the first player, they have to basically decide early on if they're going to go for those goals or not. And then people later in the turn order, they can decide if there's incentive to do so or if they should just go and do their own thing. Now, that's not the only issue with the first player thing I've seen before, but that's kind of the main complaint, is that you don't get as much agency in terms of getting those bonus scorings. To me, and I'd be curious to see what other people think about this, but to me, I feel that that's really kind of counteracted, because on the one hand, you could say the same thing, that going last is a big detriment, because all of the really kind of choice tiles that you pick, even if you want to play a surplus for them each round, that they're going to be taken. So generally speaking, early in the game, for example, any tiles that are going to give you a decent amount of income bonuses are really sought after, because especially in the early to mid game, anything that you can do to get more money is going to help you get more tiles, because the tiles get more expensive as the game goes on. So if you're going last in a 4-player game, even though it gets refilled every single, at the end of each person's turn, generally speaking, the first couple of rounds, people usually fight over the cheapest plus income tile that they can get. So if you're going last, if you're lucky and there's a lot of distribution of them early on, then you can get them. But otherwise, you may be shut out of early game plus income tiles. You may have to get money through other means, like dropping lakes or taking the generic starting tiles. Because the heavy factory, the starting tile here, that's a guaranteed one too. But there's nothing really flashy to these. So you're forgoing more useful tiles for the generic stuff, or you flip it over and you make a lake, which is just well, not these, but any of the normal tiles, you flip them over, you make a lake, and you get money bonuses off of that. But again, that's if you need to, or because you're going after a specific goal more so than that's a huge strategic advantage. So I think they're both offset. I think that you can make a claim that first player has a disadvantage, but I also see it, particularly in the early parts of the game, going first can be really huge because you could get, those cheap early tiles that you really, really want, or if there's something there that you decided on a strategy fairly early on that you want to do, you can go after them pretty easily and not have to worry about competition. So,
oh, totally.
I don't know. For me, I've heard the complaint before, but I really feel like it tends to balance out. So is there a huge disadvantage to going first? Personally, I don't. I would say no. I've heard other people argue to the contrary, but I've never felt like going first was a cause for something to lose. If anything, it just makes it so that if you're worried about the goal aspect, you can always choose not to do that. I mean, the goal things are nice because they're going to give you anywhere, depending on the goals, anywhere from like 10 to 20 bonus points at the end of the game. But you can easily build your city without really fighting over those goals and just have a really expensive, really, really worthwhile city, and you can still win without having to do it. So you can just choose to say, you know what, I'm not going to fight over those particular goals, and maybe I'll get this secondary one that I don't think other people are going for, or just say screw it and not deal with any of them and just try to have like the most valuable portion of the city you can do. So yeah, I mean, for me, I've never run into that issue. I've played it enough that I haven't experienced a continued effect that going first is somehow going to be detrimental to your chances of winning. It may be a little harder for new players to go first, but that's about it. I don't think it's
and again, that's something that's fairly common with a lot of games, is the first player does have an advantage, especially if players are new. I feel like the first player does have a bit of an advantage here, just because, I don't know, like every time I've played, the first player has done really well. But I don't know if that's just me. Could be. Yeah,
I mean, I think you'd have to play it more than once every other year to really get a feel for that. I mean, I've played, like I said, I've played it enough where I haven't seen a consistent pattern. Let me put it that way, where like, oh, if you go first, you definitely aren't going to win. That sort of thing. So, is there statistically something that bears out to that end? I don't know. I honestly don't know. I haven't bothered to get that granular into the research on this particular game. But yeah, I don't know. I think that you're probably okay in that sense, at least on average. Are there going to be occasions where it might work against you? Sure, but I think that, like I said before, there's plenty of times where I think going last can also work against you too. I've never seen I can make the argument that going last can also be advantageous as well. So, it depends how.
You're going crazy.
Yeah, that's okay. We have new guinea pigs, so that's what you're seeing behind Aaron there.
They're running laps. It's
Sweet.
exercise time.
It is exercise time. So yeah, I don't see that balance. I think player experience is going to be the bigger determining factor than your turn order. I'll say that.
Do you want to go ahead and talk about strategy?
We can do that. Where do we want to start with the idea of strategy? Because like there's a lot of, as we said, like a lot of this game comes down to like specific areas of strategy in a game.
Yeah. Do you have a preferred strategy? Like going in before you even see the tiles?
Me personally, I'm one of those people where the first few rounds of the game, pretty much regardless of what my goals are or regardless of what the tile distribution is, I'm going to go with the surefire method more often than not. I'm going to try to get, a few cheap tiles that are going to help raise my income as quickly as possible. It's not exactly the most unique thing in the world. Most people do that to some degree, but I will usually kind of aim at that more often than not. After that is kind of how I diversify. I like to get a couple of those to start the game, and then I sort of pick my strategy and run with it. But that's where I almost always start. I'd be curious how, if there's any people that don't do that. If it's a thing where you start off saying, no, I'm doing something distinctly different. I'm not going to go down the money route off the top of the game, right out of the gate, because I would be curious what a really interesting alternative would be to getting a few extra bucks each round. So maybe it's like I know that there are some like where you can you focus more on like money payouts more than like a straight income boost.
Mm-hmm.
So like building lots of lakes, for example, in a specific systematic way that'll give you lots of money, or tiles like the homeowners association and waterfront realty, which can give you lots of money by specifically placing tiles and getting money out that way, as opposed to chasing lots of the plus income tiles. So that's what I do. What about you?
I don't even know. It's so dependent on the tiles that are out there, but also on whatever my secret strategy is. I tend to base everything that I'm doing around that.
Okay. How so?
I mean, whatever that strategy is. So if it's don't have any civic buildings, then I'm going to take a strategy that involves building up a lot of things that don't benefit from having civic buildings. In the last game we played, it was don't have any lakes or have the fewest number of lakes. So my strategy was to try to avoid having lakes. That didn't work, but that was initially my strategy. I don't go in with a set thing every time. Obviously getting money is always good, so that's always like there, but I don't know. Is it still a strategy if that's just how you approach every game?
Maybe a generalized strategy.
Right. So I guess I have that. But yeah, my strategy does vary a lot from game to game.
Okay.
Overall, though, I think I probably try to go for a balance of tiles to start, because I don't like locking myself out of something really, really early. So I'll try to get a good mix of retail and industrial and residential tiles to get me going. And that way, later on down the line, like once you get into the second phase, I can specialize a little bit more, and I haven't locked myself out of anything.
Okay. That's fair. How well do you feel like that works?
Not well.
So why do you do it?
Because I only play like once a year and I forget.
Okay. That's what I mean. Like for me, I kind of go for it's not creative, but it's kind of the surefire way. And some people will like, stay with the income route and just be like, I'm just going to make as much money as I can, as fast as I can. And that can definitely work, but it's sort of you're foregoing early game, easy points earlier in the game to get money for bigger point bursts later.
Right.
So like I said, I tend to stick with a couple smaller, earlier tiles that like even the generic ones that'll give some slight money buffs early on, and then really go from there. So how I go is really for me dependent on the distribution of the tiles, like even more so than what goals are on the board and what my secret goal might be. It really for me is like what tiles come out and what's available to me, and that's kind of how I shape what I'm going to do. Mm-hmm. Because
it depends on what strategies other people are taking as well.
Absolutely, yeah, because like if you're playing like a 4-player game and at least two of you are going for the same strategy, going for the same tiles, that can be really prohibitive, because if you're both fighting over the same stuff, then it just frees up. One, you're going to fall behind, and then two, it frees up the other players to go their own route, and it just makes it so much easier. I've had that happen to me specifically. I think it was not the most recent game that we played, so not the one today, but the last time I played Suburbia, which was, or I guess the last one, so like 2 or 3 playthroughs ago, and that was a few months ago. That was a case where both me and another player were both heavily competing for the commercial tiles. So those are the blue tiles. That's these guys. You don't start the game with any of them, but they often generally give you, income and money and other beneficial effects as you expect from a commercial tile to do so. And so we were both competing for ones that give a lot of benefit to having lots of commercial tiles. And so we kept snatching them back and forth from each other as soon as we could. The problem with that was either like we were both ended up paying a surplus for them because we were trying to buy them earlier and earlier, and that was costing us more money. And then also there was fewer of them for us to fight over because we kept stealing them back and forth. Now, on the one hand, that meant less of those for the other two players, but it was really easy for one of the other players to realize that we were both fighting for the blue tiles early on and said, well, screw this. I'm going to go the residential route. I'm just going to focus on just getting lots of green tiles.
Right.
And it worked. They actually won the game because of it, just because
they didn't have a competition.
They didn't. And they could take whatever they wanted at a cheaper rate. And that person won. And they even had one of their secret goals. They just gave up on it early on because it really was the exact opposite. It would have been great for me or the other player going commercial because it was either most of those or most, I forget exactly what it was, but it was one that was more useful to us than useful to him. But he just said, you know what, forget it. I'm not going to go after this goal. I'm just going to really just gun for, cheap green tiles. And it worked. And it didn't look like he was going to run away with it at first, but as the game went on, he just kept getting more and more population boosts, and by the last quarter of the game, it kind of felt like the game was in the bag for him, even at that point, unless it was a case where I could land 3 goals in a row or something like that to come back. So that's something that you always have to be careful of.
Let's see. Oh, those 3 times investment tiles.
Yes.
I've never used them. I don't really get it. I know it's not complicated. I don't know.
Right. So, okay. So these are, I don't think I have them handy. One second. I had some of the tiles that were around, but I don't think I have those.
I'm so yawny. I don't know why.
You're tired.
Yes, that thing.
Just a guess.
Maybe.
Yeah. So so what she's referring to is the 2x investment tiles. You get 3 of these in the game, and what they are, the way it works in Suburbia, for those who aren't as familiar or don't remember them, is they're these little square markers. And what you do with them is you actually place them on. When you use one, you place it on one of your existing tiles in the game that you already have placed down, because you can't move or remove tiles once they're placed normally. So what this 2x tile does, this investment tile, is you put it down on an existing tile that you have. You pay the cost. So in this case, this condominium, you'd pay the $14 for the condominium again. And you would put that marker on that condominium. So you're going to pay the cost. And then basically you get to have the effect of the tile go off again as if you had a second copy of that tile. So if you had one that actually did something really useful, let me just look at one real quick here. So there's this one tile here, the bed and breakfast. Cost 9. It gives you 2 population, so 2 VP when you put it out, and it gives you +1 population on the track for each green tile that you have, including itself. If you were to put an investment tile on this, that means that effect would go off. So that means every green tile that you would place would get +2 instead of +1, because essentially you're acting as if you had 2 of those tiles. So these investment tiles, if used, can be incredibly powerful. One of my favorite things to do on that is to do something where it's like a great payout for money. There's a blue one that gives you $2 for each blue tile that you have. So I love putting that one down, an investment marker on that one, even though it's expensive to do so. But that means that I would get $4 every time I put a blue tile down instead of 2, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that can be an awful windfall of money, especially in the middle to late stages of the game. So it really depends on your play style to see how often you use those tiles. I would say, because the thing is that essentially prevents you from taking a tile, so you have to ditch a tile instead from the market. So you're not going to actually buy a new one. You're just basically doubling down on an existing one, which can be really, really handy if you have a good tile, but not so useful if you don't have one that it's like particularly going to give you an advantage. So it really depends on the tile distribution and your play style. I've had some games where I haven't played. I don't use any of them. I've also played some games. It's not super common, at least in my gameplay experience, to use all three. But I have seen all three played by the same player, so it is possible to do that. It really does depend on which tiles you want to use them on, because like you're not going to use them on the same like on generic tiles. You're not going to use them on basic stuff. It's usually going to be on stuff that's going to give you some sort of like really nice bonus.
Right.
So I mean, I'm sure other people can argue how much they love them. I don't have like a firm opinion on them one way or the other. I feel that they're a useful tool, but I feel that they're also easily overlooked by particularly people who have not been super experienced with the game. Because like if used correctly, if used advantageously, they can be huge. But I feel like a lot of people just tend to overlook them.
Mm-hmm. I do that.
Yeah, well, I think part of it comes down to is like you have all these neat tiles, right? That they're out in front of you, and you get to place them. They're in the marketplace. Am I keeping you up?
I'm sorry, I can't.
So you have the tiles, which are very easy and very visual to look at. The 2x tiles are just these little square chits that say 2x on them. So, you can keep them on your board, but they're just very easy to ignore. Mm-hmm. I just feel like that they don't really stand out. And I think for a lot of times, it's just a psychological thing that players tend to forget about them until somebody uses one. And then people are like, oh, yeah, that's right. Those are in this game. And then you'll see other people usually copycat. But it's often a case, particularly with more inexperienced players of the game, that they tend to just not remember to use them. Mm-hmm. But you don't have to play with them to win. Like, it's not like if you choose not to use them or you don't have tiles that can use them, that you're somehow like throwing the game at all.
What's your favorite tile?
My favorite tile? That's a good question. One of my favorite tiles, it's not one that I use all that often because it often goes contrary to like other strategies that I might be trying. Mm-hmm. But I'm a really big sucker for Waterfront Realty, which is one of the early game tiles. And what that does is that's a blue tile that says whenever you play a lake, you get an additional $2 for when you place stuff adjacent to a lake. So when you place, you can choose to place a tile face down instead of buying it, and that creates a lake tile. The lake tile doesn't inherently do anything for you, but what happens is if it's adjacent to any other tile in your board, or you put a tile next to a lake, aside from another lake tile, normally you get $2 every time that you do that. With Waterfront Realty, you get $4 if you have one of them. And that's a case where I will often do the investment tile on it and actually double down on the investment. Or if I'm really lucky and actually manage to buy both of them straight out, now you're getting $6 every time that you put something against a lake. And so I just go and just make this huge like lagoon style like board. Yes. And it's not always like, it's not necessarily a winning thing more often than not, but it's one of my more favorite things to do in the game just because of just the idea of winning by creating lots of lakes. Yes. I don't know, that to me, there's some definitely like higher, like the tier 3, because each of they're broken down into an A, B, and C pile of tiles, and the C stack have some really powerful and useful tiles, but they're also really expensive. Mm-hmm. So I just liked it because Waterfront you can get fairly early, and it's just a great little money making engine if you can utilize it right. Pulling some of the expensive stuff is really fun, you know, some of the schools that give lots of nice bonuses at the end of the game, or the PR firm, like I said earlier, that prevents the reputation loss when you hit
Yeah, I
various.
like that one. It's
Yeah,
just
but
too expensive.
yeah,
I
it's
mean,
like
I get why, but it's like really expensive.
yeah, it's like $20 or something like that, which is a lot of money in this game. That's on top of that's assuming you're paying it without any like surplus on top of it. That's a lot of money. Now, hopefully, generally speaking, if you're going to buy a tile like that, you have the money to do so, or you really want to make sure that nobody else gets it by buying it yourself. But yeah, that's a huge investment to make. That's more of an end game or late game tile to get. I like tiles, particularly my favorite tiles are ones that help me engine build, because there's a lot of engine building in this game.
So why don't we move on then and talk a little bit about the theme?
Okay, I will let you lead on this one.
Okay, so I love the city building theme. I love it in board games and I love it in video games. I just find it fun to create a little city and make everything all pretty and fit together really nicely. I like that there is kind of a puzzle aspect to it as well, where certain tiles shouldn't be next to each other and certain tiles benefit from being next to each other. So you have to really think through what you're building and where you're placing things. I really love how that all comes together. I know Suburbia is a pretty well liked and well known city building game. And I think part of that is because the way you're laying out the tiles is really unique. It's not often that you find a game that makes you start from the top of the map and work your way down. It's not often that you have a hex placement style that also has some sort of constraints on it, like Suburbia does. I think that's really cool. I also really enjoy the visuals of the game, even though they're not my normal favorite style. The game is like very minimalist. It's, you know, a lot of iconography, and it feels like I don't know, a video game, but like early SimCity style video game where graphics aren't really up to date, but the icons, they get it across. So I like that style in Suburbia. I think that it works well for the game, and it manages to convey the theme of like, take this seriously, but at the same time, it's not boring to look at, and it's not, every tile is different enough that you can't really confuse them from far away when you're not wearing your glasses like I wasn't earlier. So I think that's definite point in its favor. Ryan, what do you think?
Yeah, some people will complain about the look of the game, I feel, because like you said, it is very minimalistic. It is the tiles are not, they're not super flashy in and of themselves. You know, the distribution of the artwork here, if you see it, they're kind of straightforward. They're not flashy. They're not, you know, incredibly well defined. I mean, it's serviceable art, but it's nothing to it's no award-winning art or anything like that. But what's nice about them is once you start splaying them out in your tableau, once you start building the city, it creates this nice little mosaic, right? And it just has this fun little look of, I always like to think of it as a blueprint. It says, okay, you're laying out the blueprint of what you're trying to do as a city planner. That's kind of how in my head, how I look at it. And so when you do that, it really kind of comes together. It's you know, the sum of its parts sort of thing is what really makes me appreciate the vibe of the game. Basically, you know, between the flavor and the theme of it, it tends to work. I don't feel, as some do, that the game is too abstract. You know, because some
generic.
people
I've
or
heard
generic
that too.
Yeah, that they feel like that the you know, that the game is not as well graphically designed as it could be, or it could, you know, it's too, like you said, generic, or that it's mediocre.
I can see what they mean. I just, whatever. I don't know. I think that the style of the game was chosen very purposefully. And I think that you can definitely think, oh, this could have been a different way. This could have been done but more to my liking. But I think that the way it was done works for it.
Yeah, no, I actually agree. I like you said, I understand where the I guess areas of concern or even the critiques are coming from. it was either their first or one of their earliest games that they put out. So they've obviously learned in terms of the quality of their graphic art and their visuals and stuff in general. But there is a certain appeal to just kind of that minimalistic vibe that the game gives off. It's I don't inherently see it as a negative because of the theme. If this was a different theme of a game, if I was making some sort of farm or village or something that was equally generic, I would be more concerned with the more basic style that the game offers. But I actually feel in this case it actually doesn't detract from the game.
Kind of works for it. It has like a very bureaucratic feel.
Right. Like I said, I always think of like a blueprint about it. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of how I not necessarily justify it, but same idea. Mm-hmm. I won't say that it's going to necessarily be like a selling point of the game by any means. Mm-hmm. But I don't see it as a detraction either. I guess it's kind of in the middle for me. I think it takes what it does and it works well with what it's doing. But no, it's not going to win any visual effects awards and stuff. Though, again, I do really love the tableau look when it's all said and done. So you look. One of my favorite things to do in Suburbia, and I think you've done this too, and a lot of people do it, is like when you're done, you kind of look at your city and you go, "What did I just make?" And you try to come up with a city that like makes sense to you,
right?
So like. I just really have fun with that. When there was one game where it was just like this sprawl of like commercial areas and like there was like no residential, and it was just all like municipal gray buildings and commercial buildings, and that was it. There was no industrial area, no residential area, just this one giant like commerce and government region.
You made DC.
Yeah, and that's actually what I said. I'm like, oh, so I made the central part of DC, yep. And it was just really funny, and so stuff like that. Like I kind of like that kind of metagaming portion of it.
It's fun.
Yeah, well, it just gives a fun little extra kick to it. It's like, oh, you get to see and like, see what kind of where your imagination takes you with it when it's all said and done. Like, obviously, you're not necessarily going to build to that specific purpose. But if that's the way your thing goes, then you can look at it and say, hey, that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So just a fun little tidbit.
Mm-hmm. All right. So there's a solo mode to this game?
There is.
Have you ever? That.
I was going to ask if you've ever tried it. So that answers that question.
I haven't.
So there's two ways you can do solo mode in Suburbia. So I would obviously be curious if other people have tried the solo mode about it. The game itself, the board game itself, comes with, I think, rules for 2 different scenarios for solo play. I'd have to check. I think it's 2. And what they do is they give you essentially specific challenges that you have to do in solo mode. So you have maybe X number of turns, or you're limited by a specific number of tiles, or something like that, where you're trying to do a specific thing in a specific time frame, and to see if you can pull it off. And that's basically how the solo mode works. Can you accomplish the puzzle challenge of the game that the game is putting towards you? So the base board game gives you a couple, and then not that long ago, so within the last couple, well, yeah, not that long ago. I forget exactly when it came out, but there's a digital app for Suburbia, so you can actually play it on digital devices. And there's an entire essentially campaign mode for the Suburbia app, where you're trying to essentially build up these different cities in the U.S. and each of the cities have, I think, 3 different challenges in easy, medium, and difficult mode. And each one of them are trying to have you accomplish specific things with a specific number of rounds. So one could be like, you need to have a population, so you need to have a score of 100, but your income can only be like 3 at the end of the game. And you have essentially, X number of turns, 20 turns or something to do it. And some of them are, I've done some of them on the app, but some of them are much harder than others to do. So it is really fascinating, the different criteria that you can do out of a solo mode. So, and I don't personally get into a lot of solo mode. So if other people do, they can kind of go into more detail on this than I. But I do feel like that Suburbia is a type of game that does really well with the possibilities of creating solo mode play, because because so much of the game is tableau building, right? So aside from those occasions where you are stealing tiles from another player to prevent that from happening, from getting them, or those ones that care about what are in other people's burrows, there's not a lot where you really have to pay much attention to what other players are doing, really. You want to, I guess the goals too, like if you think that someone is clearly going for the same goal as you want to keep an eye on that. But that's not like,
I can see how that could easily be tweaked to allow for a solo mode, though.
Yeah, I'm just saying that there's not a lot of like in-player interaction in the game, so it's really easy to just take that one step further and have that be a solo game, because it is, as a tableau game often is, it is kind of already semi solo anyway. It's that multiplayer solitaire thing that some people bemoan and complain about, but other people really enjoy, depending on your archetype. I think that Suburbia is one of those ones that is more of that multiplayer solitaire, trope game, but I also think it does it particularly well because you never really feel like the turns don't take long, so you never feel like you're just sitting there, like, twiddling your thumbs, waiting for everyone else to be done. It moves pretty quickly,
right?
So I don't feel like that's actually a negative against it in that sense. So if you haven't played with a solo mode, I would encourage you to try it.
Give it a shot.
Yeah, even if you just do the app. I mean, if you don't want to pull the board game out and play the solo mode in the board game, there's always the app where you can play a lot of different options, solo options in the campaign mode to do it that way. So, yeah, and I just think it's a nice addition to it. What's really interesting, though, is that in the base game of Suburbia, you can have a solo mode option. So essentially, the game gives you gameplay options from 1 to 4. But it took until I think the second expansion for the game to actually add a 5th player. Because they did with Suburbia, they did the first expansion, which was Suburbia Inc., if I remember right. And then that added like new tiles and some new objectives and stuff. And then they had a smaller second expansion called Suburbia 5 Stars or something like that. And that was a small expansion, but it was basically enough that it gives you a new resource to worry about, stars, and it gives the option for 5th player gameplay. And then there was also, the game has been successful enough that it went off and it made its own spin-off game with Subdivision, which is like, it's in that same vibe as Suburbia, but it's a very different game on its own. But then they sort of, I guess, like, I feel like the more true sequel to Suburbia is actually their next game after that, which is actually Castles of Metke and Ludwig. I think that's actually closer to an actual sequel of sorts to it than Subdivision is. Subdivision is more thematically sequel than mechanically, whereas Castles seems to be more of the other way around. So, but I haven't actually tried it with 5 players. I don't know if anyone else has tried it with 5. So I'd be curious to see what other people think of the 5-player version. I do feel like the 4 moves fairly quickly, so it doesn't. I could see it adding a 5th player and not really making a huge deal, but I can't speak to that myself. I've never actually done the 5-player version, so I'll leave it up. I'll leave it up to other people.
Yeah. I think it's about time to wrap up. That covers everything we wanted to talk about.
Really? I thought I had more written down than that about notes.
You can go ahead and look.
I can. So well, one thing. Okay, so here's one thing that we skipped. Is and you can tell me this. So how do you? I guess it's kind of one more serious thing and then one kind of lighter thing. So when you're building your city, right? Um, how do you focus on what you're doing? Is it literally just whatever's available to you?
Yes.
Or okay, so the alternative to that is like having a specific set in mind, and if you can't get tiles that you want, or do you play prevent, where you're trying to prevent
No.
other players from having specific tiles, or do you only buy the more expensive ones that fit your strategy, or is as you said, is it just a case of whatever you can get that is the most efficient at the time for the price? I'm just curious, particularly how you actually
Me?
play that. Yeah.
I already answered it.
Well, I meant go into detail.
Oh, you can. I can't plan it out that much because I don't play it often enough to know exactly which tiles I'm expecting. So I go based on what tiles are out there and what general strategy I happen to be following that game.
Right. Okay. But do you focus on anything? I guess on the meta side of it, of like, are you keeping an eye on what like the number of other tiles of specific types that other players have? So
Generally, no. Only if there's something out in front of me that is going to have an impact on that. So if you have a ton of civic tiles and there's a really cheap tile coming out that's going to give you a bonus for all of them, then yes, I'll notice that. But I'm also not sitting there counting like how many airports you have versus how many airports I have every single turn. That's not fun for me.
right. Okay. And that's fair. I mean, I would be curious for people who play it more often, how much of that that metagaming that they do, where they are kind of constantly tracking what other players are playing and what other tiles are out and that sort of thing. Because some of the tiles they do care far more than others, and those are the only ones that I think are kind of tricky to keep track of as tiles specifically. Do you ever focus on where you are on the VP track?
No,
Why?
because I don't do that in any game ever. So why would it be different for this one?
Well, because in this one you have those different those red lines that those checkpoints where you drop down, and maybe that'll impact like your next turn or your future turns, as to like, oh well, if I only get 3 population this round, I won't hit the marker this round, but if I hit 4,
No.
I definitely go over. So you never look at it that way.
No.
It just, again, same thing. You just don't look at the VP track at all.
Don't ever think to look at the VP track. That's not how I play games. And I feel like the red lines are so close together in this game that you can't avoid them. You're going to hit them. It's just whether you hit them right now or whether you hit them at the end of your next turn. Generally, there's not a huge difference. And so I don't find it that beneficial to pay that much attention unless, again, like something really weird is happening.
Okay, that's fair. Okay. On a kind of the opposite note, have you ever done the thing? Have you done the wraparound? I'm just always curious if people who have played this game have ever done that. Okay, do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Okay, so for those who don't, the wraparound is this thing that happens in Suburbia where you have a starting tile. So this is like your starting grid, right? And you have the 3 starting tiles, and they all go underneath in a row, right? But after that, when you're placing tiles, you only have to place it on a tile that is adjacent to you, or to an existing tile. So in theory, there's no limit to where your city can go from there. So you could have one that just creates like this big, basically, circle in here and have a city, and that works perfectly fine. There's another thing that you can do, though, and it happens organically depending on where you want to place things and why, which can actually cause you to sort of go like this and actually have it build up to the side of your starting tile. And again, there's no there's nothing that prevents it. But I've seen
I'm not
people
like against it. It's just never really come up, I think.
Yeah, I've never seen a strategic reason to do it. I've seen people do it just for the sake of doing it, but I've never seen anyone do it because it was like actually super advantageous for them to do so. Because plenty of times you have these tiles that they care about being adjacent to certain things. So in order to do that, a lot of times you have to like forgo some of those useful adjacency ones because you're only going to be adjacent to the two connecting pieces, and in that sense, instead of being connected to like 3 or 4 or 5 other pieces. So
I like
I've
to
never
make my
found.
city symmetrical
Do
when I
you?
can. Yeah,
I've
it's
never.
pretty to look at.
I've never focused on making my city symmetrical. That's interesting.
It's not like I won't sacrifice good tile placement for it, but if I'm like, oh well, I can put this on the left or the right, and it'll be symmetrical if I put it on the right, then that's where it's going.
Okay. All right. That's interesting. I never see. That's the thing. That's an aesthetic portion of the game that I've never considered.
Mm-hmm.
So that's cool. I guess I get more focused on the mechanical side of it. Surprise, surprise. Mm-hmm. Okay, so what would you say is obviously for you, your favorite part is the actual building of the city?
Yes.
What is your least favorite part of the game?
I think that it can be hard to catch up if you don't have a lot of money. And if you're not generating a lot of money right off the bat, it can be hard to catch up. And if it's hard to catch up, it's hard to stay motivated in the game because you're not going to even come close. So again, I don't really get super focused on score, but when you know that you're really far behind and you're not making enough money to buy the tiles that you want to keep building your city, I find that frustrating in Suburbia.
Okay.
Yes.
I wasn't sure if there's going to be more to it than that.
No, that was it. You asked me the part I don't like, and that's the part I don't like.
Okay.
I don't feel like there's a great catch-up mechanic.
Do you think that there's a runaway leader issue in the game?
I would have to play it more.
Okay.
I can't really say.
All right. I'm just curious. I mean, so that's another complaint I've heard from some that if there's somebody who's very well versed in the game and other players are not, that can create enough of an experience gap that person can actually kind of take off. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. I personally haven't run into that too many times. Once or twice, somebody might win by, more than what you think would be the normal range of the players in the game. So if 3 out of 4 people are within 10 points of each other and one person's like 25 points ahead of them, is that a runaway leader? I don't know. To me, it's like if somebody's just clearly just 30 points out or something like that, then that's a little different than somebody who just happens to get the bonuses at the end of the game and that's the final score. Mm-hmm. So the other thing is that because as the score continues to go up on the score track, the number of those checkpoint areas increases. So it starts off being like, oh, well, you need to get 15 points before you hit your first check marks. But by you start getting up into the higher scores, it's happening like every 3 or 4 spaces. So that really slows you down in terms of how quickly you can grow and stay at that pace. So in some respects, I feel like it can actually be hard to just purely run away with the game because you're going to lose a lot of points if you go too far too fast. And then you're going to have to spend like more time playing catching up. So if you run away too quickly, you're not going to have the resources or the time to keep that pace going. So you tend to stagnate while other people catch up. So I don't know. That's just generally the vibe that I've gotten. I've seen people win by, fairly decent scores, but only a couple of times where I've really seen somebody just like completely, take off from the rest of the players. And that was more of an experience thing than like a mechanical thing of the game. That was like they got the specific tiles that they liked and they went after a very specific strategy. And the other players were sort of just trying to figure out what to do. and they took off with it. So I think in games like this that can happen where players who have done this, it's like playing with somebody who's played Puerto Rico like 30, 40, 50 times, and sitting next to somebody who's played it like twice. Like it's very, very obvious how those people are going to do comparatively. And I never liked that. I mean, Puerto Rico is just a great example of that, because like there's so many like tried and proven strategies to that game that it's like, well, if you do the X, Y, and Z strategy, you see that a lot with like war games too. Like you do X, Y, and Z strategy, and that's going to give you a pretty good chance of winning, versus somebody who's just sitting down going, oh, this looks interesting, and they grab whatever. I think Suburbia is somewhere in there as well. I think it's a case of, if there's obviously, again, depending on the distribution of the tiles that come out and the strategy that you're going for in terms of various goals or not, that it can happen on those occasions where somebody can kind of take off with it. But I think it's more experience, again, than anything else. But that's going to happen with a number of those games. I don't think that's an issue with Suburbia itself. I don't see that as a flaw of the game. I actually think overall, Suburbia is pretty solid as far as the game goes, in terms of the theme, the mechanics, the replayability. I mean, can you think of anything that just kind of stands out as like, I really wish they had changed this one thing?
Not right now.
Yeah. That's kind of my thought too, is like, sure, little things, maybe some visual things, but it's a pretty solid game mechanically, and it does what it does particularly well. So I guess to end it, my final question to you would be, what makes this particular city builder stand out for you versus other city builders?
I don't know that it does.
Oh, okay. Why is it not?
I mean, I guess the tile placement makes it stand out, like the way the tiles are placed under that board, but that's about it.
Okay. So there's nothing particularly special about this game.
I mean, if you're asking me, other than the way you place the tiles, it's very similar to a lot of other city builders, and I find the theme of some other city builders to be more engaging, although, like I said before, I don't really mind the theme of this one. Yeah.
Okay. That's fine. I'm always curious about where people's proclivities are for these sort of games. I mean, this is...
I like it. I'm not saying I don't like it.
Right. It's not going anywhere anytime soon.
Right. Like, I still enjoy playing it every time. It's just, if you're like trying to find like, oh, what's really special about Suburbia, it's hard to find something that really stands out. Like, it's a solid game, but it is fairly generic all around.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, the game has been around for like I said, 4 going on 5 years. Is that indicative of just that the amount of games that have come out like it since, or had it always come out with that kind of generic appeal from the get-go? Was there plenty of other ones that had come out before it and it just did better than those? What do you think?
I have no idea. I would have to look at like a chronology of all the games that came out before and after it. I don't know.
So the entirety of board games?
Well, that's what you're asking me.
Well, again, for just, if you like playing a lot of city builders, so just off the top of your head, if you thought that
my thing though is I never know when games have come out. Like, I don't know which games are older and which games are newer than Suburbia in general. Okay, that's fair. I just sort of play them when you pick them off the shelf. So yeah. Or like when I tell you I want to play this game, I don't tend to spend a lot of time worrying about which games are new and which games aren't. Okay. Nope. That's fair. Mm-hmm. I think for me, I would lean, since I knew you were going to ask, for me, I think it's one of those cases of, like you said, it doesn't necessarily do anything wholly original compared to other, tile placing city games. But
what it does do is it just creates a much cleaner presentation of that process. So there are others that have a little bit more flair to them. There are others that are a little bit deeper. Not that this is exactly super simple. Like you can, a lot of your chances of victory is going to boil down to like how well you can combo tiles off of each other and build up those kind of like, those tile engines of like, oh, if I get this tile and this tile and this tile and pair them all together, and you get like lots of points and payouts and stuff like that. Like that's where your depth of strategy comes in and your replayability. But it's not it's not going to be a 3-hour game. Even at 4 players, the game usually only takes about an hour and a half. So it's just a streamlined, simplified version of like super heavy city building games, but still has definitely some depth to it that other simpler ones don't. So I feel like it hits that middle ground really nicely, and it just comes together to give it some lasting, some staying power in the long run. So
I agree.
Yeah, and I think that's where I would leave it for Suburbia. It was a great excuse to get this off the shelf and play it. I always enjoy playing this game. Yeah, I always enjoy it when I play it, and no complaints, win or lose. It's usually a case of who can out civic engineer one another. So I think we'll leave it at that for this month.
Awesome.
So yeah. So thanks for people for tuning in, for listening about Suburbia for Board Game Month for November 2016. We'll be back next month. It will be before Christmas. Still date to be determined, but it'll be before Christmas. And we will do another one. And I believe for December, we're going to go with one. It's kind of on the outer edges of our kind of frame for games to pick. But it's a pretty ubiquitous game. You've probably heard of it. It's a little superhero card game called Sentinels of the Multiverse. We're going to take a look at that one. And all, not necessarily every expansion that's come with it, but we're going to dive into what makes the game so viable for so many expansions that came out after it. So grab your cape and your cloak and your mask. And
don't grab your mask. That's weird.
No, you don't grab a mask. All right. Well, do you really need a cape and a cloak then?
No,
anyway,
you don't need any of those things. You just need like YouTube.
Okay, grab your YouTube. Well, grabbing YouTube just sounds weird.
It does.
It does. So I'm not going to say that. You said it, not me. Anyway, Sentinels of the Multiverse, December. Come back in a month, and we will talk about the superhero card game that really caught people by surprise when it came out and has sort of taken off ever since. All right. What?
Bye.
Bye, guys.